Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to have a live recording, so it might be a little bit more yappy, but I want to talk about the build that I'm doing on my first account, or my second account actually, the one where we're starting from scratch. And we're going to be talking about the magnetized discharge mag. So let's get started here. So with mag, you can start the game with her. You do not need to have the primed version, as you can see I have here, of course, as in my second account. I'm not using a primed version. There is two builds that I primarily want to talk about. This is the build that we're actually focusing on the second account without the greedy pool augment. We're just doing the magnetized discharge by itself. And the way it works is you have the magnetized discharge augment here, which is going to disarm enemies when on the explosion. But the most important thing is that it gives you extra range for the magnetize. And of course does the explosion on either duration end, or you can manually detonate your magnetize to do the explosion. And if you don't know what magnetize does, you are going to mark a target, and the target will attract all incoming projectiles into the center. So this works quite well by itself, but we can take a really good advantage of it with a certain weapon, or actually there are many weapons in the game that can take advantage of it, but we're looking for a very particular weapon that you acquire very early on in the game. That, of course, being the Nataruk bow. And the Nataruk bow you acquire after finishing the new war story quest, and this will allow us to transition this build from essentially just magnetize helping us do damage to magnetize actually scaling really well into the end game, clearing maps, allowing us to control objectives and all kinds of different things. So one thing to note here, this build does not run any defensive mods, so you have to be very careful with the way you play this build. The main thing that's keeping us alive here is of course shield gating. If you're unfamiliar with how shield gating works, it's essentially when your shield breaks, you will get an invulnerability period of, I believe, 1.5 or 1.8 seconds. And it is based on the amount of shields you had when it broke. So at this moment, we have 555 shields. If our shields were to break from full, we get 1.8 seconds. If our shields were to break from 100, then we only get like 0.4 seconds. So we always want to make sure that our shields are as high as possible. And the beautiful thing about Mag is that she has inbuilt Polarize. Now Polarize does remove enemy armor and shields, but it also instantly restores all of your shields. So the general gameplay defensively wise is going to be as soon as you hear the thump and you see your life bar go gray, that means your shields have been broken and you are now invulnerable for a brief period. You're going to cast Polarize during that brief period, or if your shield is getting uncomfortably low, you can just cast Polarize to get all your shields back. So let's talk about the actual stats that we're aiming for with this build. So as you can see here, I run Blind Rage. In the beginner-friendly version of the build, I've simply run Intensify, and I can try and replicate it more here. It is going to look more like this, right? And then you can run Secrets on the side. The main thing is we're just trying to get enough strength to offset the overextend for maximum range. You can of course just not run the overextend if you don't have it yet. The range is nice though for the maximum explosion. And the more strength you have, the better technically, because of the disarm chance for magnetized discharge. But at the moment, I think on my side account, the way it looks is like this. And this is already quite a bit of range and helps you play the build quite comfortably. Arcane Energize is optional here because of Fleeting Expertise and Equilibrium usually give us more than enough to sustain everything. And do keep in mind that every mod that you see here that's rank 10, if you're at those early stages in the game, you do not need to max out these mods. Every single R10 mod can be left at rank 7, at least in the early stages, and only really invest into it once you have the endo to spare. So that would mean the build would look pretty much like this, right? Like you'd have R7 Transient Fortitude, R7 Equilibrium, and you can either have overextend, or if you don't feel comfortable, you could have some kind of shield mod like a cord, right, or redirection. Also, you see I'm running primed sure-footed here. This is just something I'm running personally. Obviously, the direct replacement for this would be power drift. This is something that I highly recommend because it gives you strength, which pretty much every single frame can utilize, but it gives you a chance to resist knockdown. So this is a pretty much direct replacement here that's better than non-primed sure-footed. So I don't really recommend to run normal sure-footed, just run power drift if you don't have this. Or of course, if you don't have animal instinct on your pet yet, you can run thief's wit. So let's talk about auras. So aura-wise, we're running growing power here. If you don't have access to it, that's fine. Just run a normal dreamer's bond, right? There are other auras that are good as well. A brief respite is not good in this build, even though we're focusing on shield gating, because we already have a way to restore all of our shields instantaneously, so you can ignore brief respite. Other things that are useful though would be like corrosive projection or shield disruption here. Shield disruption removing maximum shields. So if you have a weapon like our Nataruk is going to be viral heat, so that's going to struggle with shields. So this is actually not even that bad, but this directly amplifies the magnetize, which we're of course abusing in this build. Right, so let me quickly fix the build here back to what it was for the maximum range. So I will also show the other version of the build. And here we're going to run Umbral Intensify instead of normal. Oh, we already have Intensified there. So we're going to do this and then bring in a Blind Rage. And once again, as you can see, I have multiple copies of Blind Rage here. This is something that's really worth noting. Blind Rage is a corrupted mod, and it's one of those mods where it really benefits you having multiple copies of it, because depending on the build and whether the abilities are too expensive, you can play around with which one feels more comfortable. Right, so here's a rank 7 one. We do go under 200, but if you are running Power Drift, you'll still be over 200 because it gives 15, right? Or if it still feels too expensive, you can of course run an R5. But we do need some strength here to offset the overextend. Do keep that in mind if you are running it. Okay. Okay, so I do want to make a few more notes before I show the other version of the build. So we are trying to reduce our duration in this build. As I said, you can manually detonate magnetize, but generally it's much nicer to just be able to mark the target with magnetize and then shoot into it and continue playing, so you don't have to manually detonate every bubble, which is precisely why I have a very specific setup here between transient fortitude and fleeting expertise. I'm reducing the duration here just enough to have 4.5 seconds on my magnetize. This will act very similar to the lens bow, if you've ever played with that before, where you have a small priming period and then it detonates and does the explosion. And this is perfect for us. If you want to have a little bit less, then you can try going with a maxed out transient fortitude, which will bring it down to 3.38. That does become a bit problematic. That one less second, sometimes if you get knocked down, if you're not running primed sure-footed, you don't get the shot in, and it's a little bit awkward, then you have like a wasted magnetize. So I do personally recommend the 4.8 seconds. And then in 4.5, sorry, and then in the other build, we don't run fleeting expertise, we run flow because we actually like the added duration. It's played more like a point defense. And I'll show that in a second. But before that, let's talk about the arcanes. Arcane-wise, you could use Molt Augment to directly improve Magnetize, but I found that you get a lot more damage in if you run Arcane Rage, because we are going to be using a bow. The headshots here will proc quite easily. As you can imagine, the arrow is going to be flying in the center of Magnetize, and eventually it'll headshot something, and you pretty much have a permanent uptime on your Arcane Rage. Because I'm not using flow in this build, I do run an energize. This is just to help me in skirmish missions like exterminate or capture when I'm quickly moving through the map. I don't have the time to stop and worry about equilibrium, so that singular orb that I get will keep me up and running for pretty much the entire mission. Other arcanes to consider would be something like Arcane Nullify. Right, Nullifier is really good in general. The magnetic effect is incredibly powerful, especially since you're a shield frame. Another one to consider would be Arcane Resistance here. Arcane Resistance makes you immune to toxin status effect specifically, not the toxin damage, do keep that in mind. The toxin clouds that the infested create do pure toxin damage before they apply the status effect, so you can still instantly die to that, and you really have to be careful with a build like this when playing against Infested. But this will prevent you from getting affected by the status effect, of course, which can be quite nice. Okay, so let's talk about the second variation here. So this variation of the build focuses more on doing survival. The reason for that is because we actually want the extra duration here. As you can imagine, you can create choke points with a magnetize like this, and with the bow that we're going to be using, it's going to essentially create a blender inside the magnetize where enemies get pulled to the center and instantaneously killed. And at the end of the duration, it's going to explode for 25% of the damage we've done with said blender and pretty much detonate for like 10 million damage or something like that. Like I've seen it go all the way up to like 50 or 50 million plus, right? So normally you're doing at least 500,000 up to like 50 million, depending on how tanky the enemies are, of course. So it's a very similar setup beyond that. We just only really care about replacing the fleet and expertise with flow because we now care about duration. And you can maximize your strength here. So as you can see here, I'm 254. If I run an Umbral Intensify with growing power, I'm over 300% strength. This is obviously really good if you need the damage, but I don't really feel like we need the damage between everything going on here in the bow we're going to be running. So I use a greedy pool, which allows us to sit much further back and essentially pool all the items to us from a very long distance. So this way we're always safe and nothing is endangering us, and we can pull all the pickups to us and continuously just stay in like relatively the same position, creating those choke points and killing the enemies. Additionally, of course, since we also now care about strength, we don't want to run overextend here, and also I've tried running it with overextend instead of reach, and the bubble it creates essentially ends up being way too big. Since we aren't going for map clear with this one, we want to create choke points. When the bubbles are too big, then you can't have them in multiple places. Sort of imagine like a small room and you have one bubble taking up 75% of the room, then you can't really create another one for a separate door choke point on the other side, because if you aim at the bubble and you press 2 to activate magnetize, it'll detonate that bubble. So we want to make it a little bit smaller so that we can have one bubble on one side for one door and then another one on the other side for the other door. So let's talk about the weapon. The weapon, of course, being the Nataruk bow. And with the Nataruk bow, you can see I'm running a ribbon here, but I'll make a copy of this quickly that does not include the ribbon, so give me a second. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here with this Nataruk build. So the Nataruk is a very powerful bow that has a lot of critical chances, you can see here, and has a very easy to activate perfect shot, which we're mostly aiming for here. So just with a critical delay, you can reach 180% critical chance, and we're going to focus on viral and heat elements. The reason being, of course, is that we already have damage amplification coming in from Magnetize, so we break overguard quite easily, and we'll have access to their actual health bars relatively quickly, and then do absolutely crazy damage stacking to help proc our Magnetize explosion, of course. So you will always want to start with multi-shot, then we add the viral heat. As you can see, we run it here. I run a 90 damage heat because it's always better to have heat higher than your secondary element. In this case, we're not quite able to hit it, but if you didn't know, the status that procs is based on the damage that it does. So you can see the breakdown here. Right now we have 42% chance for viral and 31% chance for heat. If we run a thermite round, this will give us higher chance to proc status overall, but much less chance to proc heat itself though. Well, in this case it's not that much of a difference, I guess. Well, it is actually quite a bit different because it's 60% and 30% heat. So do keep that in mind when you're making this build. Otherwise, it's pretty standard. There's not really too much going on here. We run the critical damage, obviously very powerful. We run Serration. Once again, rank 7 Serration is just fine. You don't need a maxed out one. You can of course upgrade with a galvanized chamber once you have that unlocked. And we run a fire rate mod here to offset the critical delay, otherwise charging up the arrow takes forever. And the set bonus here is very nice. If you're wondering where I'm running the rest of the set, you can run the Vigilante set on your Sentinel weapon, and it'll still activate for your primary weapon. So you can offload pretty much almost the entire set to your Sentinel weapon, and then just run the Vigilante Fervor on the bow. So let's talk about how to upgrade this build even further when you are min-maxing it. The obvious thing would be, of course, to get an Arcane. And there are two Arcanes that come to mind. That, of course, being Primary Merciless. Primary Merciless gives you extra damage on hit and is quite powerful here. The reload speed is not really utilized. And then the other one being Primary Frostbite. Now you might wonder, how do we actually proc this? We don't have any cold damage in our build. But your Sentinel weapon and the cold damage that your Sentinel weapon does actually does proc this. So since we're already running the Vigilante set, we run the cold damage on our Sentinel weapon as well. And this helps us proc Primary Frostbite. This creates more projectiles, gives us more critical damage, which we already have over 100% critical chance, so we always do crits. And the multi-shot is obviously nice because of the interaction between the arrows and magnetize, which I will show later. The other things that you can upgrade here is, of course, getting rid of the Vigilante Fervor for a Riven that already has fire rate in it, and hopefully a little bit more crit chance. Because if we do get a Riven like that, we'll break the 200% critical chance. So let's take a look at a build like that. So as you can see here, I'm running a fire rate, damage, critical chance. The most important stats being, of course, fire rate and critical chance to break that 200% crit. Okay, and then I run a galvanized chamber, which is a direct upgrade to the normal chamber. If you are killing things, that is. If you are doing something like Eidolons, then obviously the normal chamber is better, since you're not really going to be killing much. And otherwise the build stays the same, Primary Frostbite and Viral Heat. And we still use critical delay. Technically we could take it out, but more crit is better, since we can hit the red mark at 300% much easier this way. A quick breakdown of the Jhin as well, since we are a very squishy build that relies on shield and shield gating. Sometimes we go down to Toxin, or due to simple misplays. So running a pet that can bring you back to life is very useful. I run a Guardian. This is very useful in these builds because this will shield gate for you just in case you make a mistake or don't do it in time. We run the Sacrifice mod. This you will have to buy with Platinum for another player. I don't believe this is available right now. This was from an event. But this is what brings you back to life in case you die. We run Reawaken, we run Restorative Bond. This is to help bring back the Sentinel faster after it dies using the Sacrifice. You don't need to run Enhanced Vitality, but I do like it here so the pet doesn't die to random toxin like we do. Then of course Animal Instinct. This replaces Thief's Wit, allows you to see through walls, see containers. Very useful, must have. Regen, once again, this is just to bring back our pet faster. If you don't have the primed version, you don't need to worry about it, just run normal regen. Duplex Bond, this just helps our pet fly around and proc the cold more often, slowing enemies, just easing the playstyle, applying corrosive and magnetic to enemies. And here's the general weapon build for Verglass. We run the Vigilante set, as I spoke about earlier. Here I'm opting not to run the final Vigilante mod, and I run the Beam Length. Unfortunately, Sentinel weapons don't have an Exilis. Obviously, this would normally go in the Exilis slot, so we have to sacrifice the Vigilante for the Sinister. Then we run Corrosive, Magnetic, and Cold. So Cold is obviously to help us proc our primary Frostbite. We run Corrosive because we don't run Corrosive on our weapon. This will help us strip armor from enemies that have a lot of armor, and usually you have to pick between Corrosive and Viral, and whichever you don't run on your weapon, you have to run on your Sentinel so that you can prime both, right? So you're not missing out on that. And then we run Magnetic. This helps us both deal with shield and overguard being a really big issue sometimes on some Eximus enemies. Alright, so now we're in the Simulacrum. Let's spawn some enemies and let's see how this works. So I've already tested this build both in survival, defense, and I'm actively playing this build on my secondary account. So it's a very trusty build that I rely on a lot for pretty much right now. I'm trying to unlock Steel Path on the secondary account, and I'm exclusively using this build. It's super powerful for all game modes. Let's talk about the enemies we're spawning here. I'm spawning a very specific enemies here that I consider pretty much the strongest Eximuses from each faction specifically. Some of these enemies, like the newest one being the Tekrot Bao, they are extremely powerful, and they take reduced damage, like ridiculously reduced damage, so we will not be one-shotting them. Don't be surprised if some of these enemies don't get one-shot. Sometimes there are extra mechanics to them and things like that. And of course they're as high of the level that can go here. So, and there it's on steel path. So we'll simulate this. So all I'm saying is, in general, this build will pretty much very neatly clean everything and clear the all content in the game comfortably, unless you can't apply magnetize to the enemy for some reason. So let's switch to our second loadout for the bow, just to test the non-ribbon version. And loadout wise for the mag, we're using the maximum detonation range. So this has less strength in it, and in general just does maximum explosion radius, and has over 100% chance to proc the disarm. So let's give it a go here. So the build is very simple, right? Once again, if you are ever low on shields, then all you really have to do here is just press polarize. This will restore all your shields. As you can see, that didn't really do any damage. But the main way this build plays is you just apply the magnetize. You have 4.5 seconds to fire your perfect shot in there. And the beautiful thing about the Naturuk bow, as you saw there, the explosion did 1 million, killed a bunch of enemies, everybody else lost their overguard, got disarmed, and yeah, took a lot of damage even though they weren't the primary focus of that explosion or the magnetize itself. So why the Naturuk bow? The Naturuk bow has infinite punch through, even through walls. I can maybe kind of show it here. Okay, I can't really show it here, but if you've ever used the Naturuk, it has incredible, like, it literally says that it has infinite punch through. So the way we can abuse it with magnetize, as you can imagine, since this attracts projectiles to the center of the magnetize, and as you can see here, it also pulls them to the center, it essentially creates this blender in the middle. Because the arrow lasts for an infinite duration, it will stay there in the center until the duration of magnetize goes out, and then the arrow will finally be released. So every time it pierces the enemy, then is pulled back to the center, pierces the enemy, pulled back to the center, and that keeps going until the duration of the magnetize is finished. And then the arrow is finally released and flies out. So this is why the multi-shot in the primary frostbite is so powerful, because we get more arrows doing this exact gimmick. And as you can, so once again, similar thing here, then the explosion happens. As you can see, some of the enemies died here, but we can spam this, right? Like in a real mission, you could press this on different enemies, have multiple explosions happening at the same time, they're being crowd controlled, they're being detonated, they're being disarmed. So good, clear, right? And with this version of the build, because this focuses on maximum range, you can apply it to an enemy, shoot, and then keep moving. That part of the map dies. Do the next enemy, and you clear, exterminate extremely quickly. And of course, the Naturuk bow, being a very powerful bow, actually kills a lot of the capture targets or XMSs quite handily by itself, even if you can't apply magnetize to them. So let's try it now with the Riven version, but not much is really going to change. After all, the entire point here is just to really get more crit chance in there, and we will be proccing the Galvanized Chamber for even more multi-shot. Do be careful with all this multi-shot, because we have so many arrows bouncing inside the magnetize, it does tend to lag you out sometimes. So you gotta be careful with that. Oh, and of course you can fire multiple arrows in there. The one enemy in particular that does lag you out would be the Acolyte on Steel Path. I don't remember which one it is, but one of them has projectile deflection, and it interacts in a very funny manner with this ability and this playstyle, where it keeps trying to deflect the arrows, but they still get magnetized to the center. That usually drops my FPS from like 140 all the way down to 5. You gotta be very careful with that one in particular. Right, so I'm actually going to change my opinion here a little bit. Rather than doing a time-based mission, we'll do a quick exterminate clear just to showcase how the build works, because you will be able to see the magnet, and as of you already seen, the magnetize pulling the enemies to the center. I'm just going to pick the Zariman mission here. It doesn't really matter which one, it's just picking like a higher level essentially. I guess I could have picked the Hex for the highest level, but this build works very similar in all difficulties. you're essentially just going to mark an enemy with magnetize, and you're just going to fire your arrow at them, creating this beautiful blender that pulls enemies to the center. If you're starting to low on energy, run low on energy, sorry, then of course you can wait for the explosion to go off, right? The bow itself is obviously very powerful too, right? So if you don't, right now we don't really have any energy, that's fine. We're just gonna play it a little bit slower. This is also why I run the energize, by the way, right? As you can see, especially if you're doing it on missions like exterminate, sometimes you don't get many energy orb drops, and that singular energy orb that you pick up, it better replenish your entire energy pool, or it's going to be very awkward when you're running a build that relies on clearing the entire map with a singular ability that doesn't have any energy to do so, and we're very squishy, so if we ever run out of energy, that might pretty much spell death for us, so we got to be very careful. And you know, if we have energy, we can go fast. If we don't have energy, we can play it slow and just take our time. Here we have a Thrax. Thrax got one shot by the explosion. Beautiful. There we go, kill that thing. So the one thing to watch out for with this build would be, of course, the nullifiers or the disruptors, anything that disables abilities. The beautiful thing about Magnetize, though, is that it does detonate before it disappears. Right, so, you know, with nullifiers, some abilities are usually disabled, and then nothing happens. But the Magnetize with Magnetize Discharge actually explodes as it disappears. So if you manage to deal some damage, and then a nullifier comes in and touches your Magnetize, it will explode before it disappears. Doing some clear, hopefully, and hoping you know, helping you clear the map and be safer, right? So the higher level content you are, you gotta watch out. Your shields are pretty much instantly broken, but we do have our polarize for that. Make sure you always have some energy left over for that purpose. Kill that little Thrax there. Just keep going. So yeah, we can obviously go a little bit faster. It's just mostly so that I can explain as I go along. Let's do that. You can see there's some FPS drops going there. Obviously, like I said, do be careful, especially if you're getting close to it. That was literally like 60 FPS chunk that I lost there. So here's a nullifier. Let's get rid of the nullifier before he gets in my magnetize. Those are being the big issue here. Your sentinels do help you destroy nullifier shields because we are burning through a lot of energy. So you see my duplex coming in handy here as it flies around and slows enemies. And of course also destroying the nullifier orbs. You can also see the Guardian coming in handy. I'm having to polarize way less than normal because every once in a while my Jin just gives me all my shields back. Right, and right now it got broken and it's probably down. So we're going to play it a little bit slower. Polarize here to get our shields back. Then magnetize, move back a little bit. Manually detonate so that I can apply another one. Here the wall is in the way. There we go. We made the blender. So which enemies... Oh, so here I'm out of energy, so we can move back a bit. You can drop a pad, or you could have just shot your bow. I have a lot of pads, so I'm just going to take that. Here I see a Thrax is hunting me. Let's get rid of the Thrax. There we go. Beautiful. So the enemies you're looking to magnetize are obviously the overguarded Eximuses. The beautiful thing about magnetize is that, you know, overguard disables a lot of different crowd controls. But with the way magnetize works, if you apply it to the Eximus, it pretty much can't do anything. Like, it can't shoot at you. Like, what is it going to do? Like, it's just going to look at you, right? If it tries to fire anything at you, then it'll just hurt itself. So yeah, like, if you see Eximuses, especially overguarded Eximuses, like Jade Light or whatever, that's the enemy you're looking to magnetize, because that's the enemy you want to kill anyway. There's an Eximus over there. Break the shield. Apply magnetize, and we kill it. Alright, so then we finished the exterminate. And now we can bail. And there you go. Oh, well, maybe we should have stayed for a little bit longer just to show off the Acolyte. But it works pretty similar, right? Because we will just magnetize him and he'll pretty much instantly die due to the arrows. If it is the projectile reflecting one, it doesn't matter, but it will tank your FPS. So be very careful with that, right? If you have a lower NPC, this might not be the build for you, but at least try it and see what happens, right? Like I said, even if you tank your FPS, not like the game, I've never really had it crash on me, as of yet at least. But anyway, thank you for watching. This is the general build, especially the build that I'm doing on my second account right now for most clear in the game. The other one being the Mirage, and I will go into it at a later date, but there isn't really much to say there since it's a very simple buff frame that just increases your weapon damage, and this is one of the more interesting builds that we'll be running on that account, especially with the interaction between the Naturuk bow and the Magnetize. Well, like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you have a good one.